Hold on to your seats, folks. In this intense discussion, Jay Dyer takes on a Mormon with his usual calm. Well, mostly. Watch as the conversation heats up and Jay almost loses it. Spoiler alert, he kind of does. When the truth is on the line, sometimes even the calmest debater can't keep their cool. Don't miss this fiery exchange.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is probably just on the surface, one of the most maybe difficult elements for me in terms of what I mean, I'm not an expert on Mormonism. Over the years, I've done a decent amount of research. I've read Talmage, one of your systematic theologians, and other kind of older texts from Brigham Young and Joseph Smith, and Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, various sermons that Smith gave over the years. But I think one of the most difficult things for me to understand is the added sections where Joseph Smith added about 13 or 12 or 13 verses to Genesis 50, which included himself being prophesied in the book of Genesis. To me, that on the surface just completely destroys this entire religion.
The Joseph Smith translation was not necessarily intended to be like, oh, this was actually in Genesis, or even necessarily like, this is canon.
Okay, so I can add to the Bible and present it as if it's a prophecy. I mean, you understand these verses are intended to predict and prophesy Joseph Smith.
You absolutely can, and this is something
that
the Book of Mormon talks about, where Nephi is reading in Isaiah, and he says, well, I read this and I liken the scriptures unto myself. So he tries to find himself in the scriptures and let God teach him new things about himself or about God from the scriptures, rather than seeking a strictly
are you aware of the way that, for example, Muslims do this with Muhammad in the book of John or in Deuteronomy, that those passages are prophesying Muhammad?
But they don't necessarily. But like, we don't use the Joseph Smith translation as like evidence.
It doesn't matter whether you use it now, because it's evidence of a con man. He's a fraud.
You could say it like that, but you could also say, well, an actual prophecy would look like that way too, right? Like,
no, actual prophets don't add themselves 1,800 years later to the text.
Any Jew reading the book of Matthew would say, these are clearly the apostles retroactively reading prophecies about Jesus Christ.
Not at all. Totally not true. Number one, it wouldn't matter what Jews say, but that's not at all. That's the argument Jesus himself makes, not the Pharisees. It's Jesus saying that these Old Testament passages predict me. Totally different than retroactively saying 1,800 years later the book of Genesis, which actually is thousands of years later, retroactively the book of Genesis predicted Joseph Smith. That's preposterous.
So Jesus saying 1,800 years earlier, Moses predicted me.
Are you aware of what the Gospel of John says? Jesus doesn't just say those books predicted me. He says, I spoke through those prophets.
Sure, yes. But
no, that's not the same. What did I just say? What did I just say?
He said that Jesus said he spoke through the prophets.
Does Jesus say that?
Even before. What?
Does Jesus claim that in the Gospels?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's different that's totally different than what you're talking about.
Well, again, for a Jew who rejects Jesus Christ,
that's a fallacy. Do you understand how dumb this argument is? Jews reject the Book of Mormon.
Sure.
So what the heck does Jews have to do with anything? That's a stupid argument. That's a dumb argument. What does Jews have to do with anything?
I'm saying that the same principle by which you're discounting.
No, you're using a fallacy. It's not the same principle. You're way off. Retroactively saying 1,800 years later.
Well, whatever you think it is, like the same logic could be used by someone who is inclined to argue against Christ.
No, it couldn't. That's the false equivalence. You don't see the difference there?
1 second, I'm cutting out.
If Joseph Smith said, I spoke through the spirit that was speaking in Genesis. It was my spirit speaking in Genesis to predict me.
Okay, obviously Joseph Smith.
Shut up, man. Well, you're not going to stop talking when I'm explaining this to you. Why do you keep interrupting?
Let me continue. Right?
Why is this funny?
I'm hearing you out.
Yeah, but you're giggling. Why are you giggling? Are you giggling at the idiocy of Mormonism?
Snorting at it.
I mean, I would be giggling too if I was a Mormon, because all this stuff is completely stupid. So again, if Joseph Smith said, "I am speaking through Genesis," that would be
Obviously
all right. If you don't stop,
I understand it,
if you don't stop talking over me and interrupting, we're done. That's just so stupid. You want to call back in and try to get a better connection because I think there's a delay. You're welcome to call back in and try again, but it's just I'm not going to talk to somebody who talks every 2 seconds when I start talking. No, there's not an equivalence between Jesus saying, "I spoke through Moses. All of the revelation in Genesis is about me because I was the one speaking through all of those texts." Peter says it was the Spirit of Christ that prophesied through the Old Testament. That's not the same thing as Joseph Smith saying, "I'm going to add verses to the book of Genesis that predict me." That's a totally false equivalence. That's how stupid this is.
And that's a wrap. Jay Dyer brought the heat, and by the end, even he couldn't hold back his passion for truth. Whether it's highlighting questionable foundations or shutting down shaky arguments, Jay leaves no stone unturned and no temper untested. If you enjoyed this fiery discussion, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more debates, deep dives, and maybe a few more epic Jay Dyer moments. See you next time.